All right, Anar Bata is also in London, where I am, and she's with the U.S. and America's program at Chatham House, a think tank in London. Hi, Anar, how are you?
Hi, Dana. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm good. How are you?
My head is spinning today because I'm watching this drive-by coverage of Donald Trump, who left the hospital at the Walter Reed Medical Center and then, in a hermetically sealed vehicle, drove around with Secret Service agents waving at his supporters outside the hospital. And I'm just, like everybody else, a little breathless over it. I can't believe that he did it. And so many medical people are, condemning him for it. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised some really good points. I think at this point in time, it's hard to be surprised by what Trump will do next. As you say, yesterday on the 4th of October, he took a joyride outside of his hospital. He's gotten a lot of criticism for that recently for endangering the Secret Service agents that were in the car with him. Apparently, the way that the car was sealed made it even more likely for the COVID particles to get past to Secret Service agents. But I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that Trump, he likes the fanfare, he likes the attention. He's very concerned about his image, and I think he wants to show voters that he's very tough. He's not get overcome by this virus. We're less than a month to go until the election, so engaging with voters, especially in swing states, is very essential right now. And he's not going to have the opportunity to meet with them in person anymore or to stage his big rallies that were so popular in 2016. So I think that was his attempt at engaging with the voters, however reckless it was. And the backlash that he's facing, his core supporters are still there defending him. So I'm not sure, despite the criticism, whether or not that move really hurt him.
Well, blame it on the steroids. The view from overseas on America's handling of COVID, and specifically Trump's handling of it. I mean, when you're sitting here in London, the view is a lot different than when you're in the U.S., I think. And so, how do Europeans, and even here in Britain, where there's been some maybe 65,000 excess deaths due to COVID-19, Britain's been hit hardest in Europe. How do you think people view what's going on in America?
So I think America's global image has really suffered quite dramatically, especially with coronavirus. I think, that was already starting to take a hit when Trump became president in 2017, and it has just dropped significantly since the COVID pandemic has started. I do think there is a difference between how it's perceived on the ground here and how it's perceived in America. So, his handling a bit over here seems very chaotic, very mismanaged. Not listening to science, not listening to facts, ignoring his advisors. I think, the European partners definitely are hoping for a change in administration.
Are people
With a
laughing at him?
pandemic.
I mean, let's be honest about it. Do you think that people look at Trump? I mean, we've seen world leaders from Trudeau to Macron to Merkel. I mean, rolling their eyes when they're around him. I mean, is he laughed at in Europe, do you think?
I definitely don't think he's taken as seriously as a presidential candidate should be. I don't know if they're laughing so much as recoiling in fear, because the U.S. does play a very important role as the leader of democracy and the defender of freedom. And I think European partners are getting a bit worried by recent U.S. actions that seem to be undermining these values that the U.S. has stood for and European partners stand for. So I think there is criticism of Trump in terms of whether or not he's a capable leader, but it's more so, what does this mean for our region? How does this impact our interests?
I mean,
What will another 4 years of Trump?
I know a lot of
Sorry.
diplomats and people based in different countries for the US who have worked on human rights, who have worked on free speech. And I think that they are, deeply alarmed that America has either withdrawn internationally, or just has lost a lot of credibility. So, how does this play internationally when you have Trump on issues like the election, where he's undermining the American election, where he's saying that the mail-in ballots amount to election fraud, that maybe he's not going to accept the result, maybe there's not going to be a peaceful transition of power. I mean, And how does that play when you're watching things in Eastern Europe, like Belarus right now, where there are demonstrators out every weekend demonstrating against widespread election fraud carried out by the ex-president, Lukashenko?
Yeah, I mean, it's very concerning. I think, European partners definitely want to see America as a defender of democracy. As you mentioned, peaceful transition of power, that's a cornerstone of any democratic nation. Trump has already made it very clear that he's not going to accept whatever results come out if they're not in his favor. He's already stroking flames of elections and voter frauds and things like that. So, I mean, I think there are a number of different tactics that Trump has used to undermine different democratic institutions within the states and internationally, which is very concerning as populism and authoritarianism is on the rise. And, by being distracted with these internal divisions, that gives external actors like Russia more leverage in terms of manipulating what's happening in Belarus in their own favor. So it is worrying about what the future of democracies globally will be like if Trump gets reelected.
Do you think it sends a message anything goes? I mean, if it can go on in America, it can go on anywhere. And leaders like Lukashenko, and I mean, Putin does what he wants anyway. But I mean, leaders like Lukashenko think, if Trump's doing it, I can do what I want. And not only is America distracted, but their
Yeah.
president's not going to stand up and criticize me. Look what he's doing in his own country.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it emboldens authoritarian actors. In the past, the US would be considered the bulwark against these nefarious influences or these negative influences. I don't think that's going to be the case anymore. Trump has, cozied up to authoritarian leaders. He, has a reportedly very close relationship with Erdogan in Turkey. He's, not taken very aggressive measures against Russia. He didn't impose sanctions after reports came out that had put bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. So there are a lot of different factors.
And Navalny, by the way, the poisoning of Navalny, the
Yes,
main opposition
yes.
candidate in Russia, where Trump was asked over and over again about it, and he, basically danced around it and avoided answering. And we'll see about that later. And he didn't condemn it. I mean, there are other members of the government that have condemned it, but Trump specifically has not come out and condemned it.
Yeah, and that's, also worrying for European partners who want to have a united Western front against Russia. So we're seeing Germany and France very critical of Russia over the Navalny poisoning, but they don't have the backing of the US, and they might not trust the US to partner with them.
Do you think Joe Biden's going to be a tiger?
Russian.
Do you think Joe Biden's going to be a tiger for Putin to deal with? Biden will be much tougher.
I think Biden will definitely be much tougher. He's already openly called Russia an opponent. He's already said that he's elected president in 2020, and there is evidence of Russia interfering in the U.S. election, which there is, that he would take a much harder line of action against them than Trump did. So, I think a second Trump term, bit of a tongue twister, sorry about that. A second Trump term would be in Putin's favor, very much so. Trump has, caused a lot of divisions within his European partners. He's constantly undervalued the role of NATO. He has given Russia a huge strategic victory within the Middle East. Biden has also said that he would have been much tougher in that area. He would not have abandoned the Kurdish allies and pulled out the US troops as Trump did. So there are multiple different areas where we can see that Biden would operate a much tougher stance against Russia, including imposing sanctions and working with like-minded
because
partners.
President Obama generally, when you take a look at his report card at the end of his term, a lot of people thought he was soft in foreign policy areas. And you think Biden will be tougher?
I do think so. I think the fact that Obama was soft kind of empowered Putin to, go a little bit further in terms of disinformation campaigns that we were seeing in 2016. Had Obama been a bit tougher on Russia, he might not have been as willing to do that. So I think, the Democrats have learned their lesson in a certain way and know that they now need to be a little bit tougher. The digital era has given Russia a lot more powers than they had before, a lot more influence than, they would have had 20 years ago. And those factors really need to be accounted for.
Talk to me about Biden and his, the Paris Accords and the reduction of carbon emissions. I mean, Trump basically is a global warming denier, and Biden has articulated some pretty clear goals, including carbon neutrality by 2050 which is like 10 years before China has come out with its plan now for 2060. Do you think Biden right away in the Paris Accords will re-sign America up and realign America with a lot of the countries who believe that global warming is rapidly taking place, and then America's got to get on board?
Yeah, I definitely think Trump will re-sign up to the Paris Accord. I think that will send a very clear signal to European partners that the last 4 years were just an aberration of U.S. policy and U.S. global leadership. Biden, I think it's very important for him to commit to a multilateral agenda to combat these major challenges that are affecting the entire world. One country can't go at it alone, but you do need major power in order to facilitate cooperation amongst other nations. And whether or not that's symbolic or actually hard power, either way, Biden's commitment to the Paris Accords will show the US's commitment to climate change and influence other powers to take them seriously as well.
You want to take a run at American foreign policy with regard to Iran?
I'm not familiar with Iran, if I'm being entirely honest. My assumption would be that Biden would attempt to negotiate with Iran and convince them to rejoin the JCPOA. I'm not sure how successful he would be. It would be hard to convince them that, something's not going to happen again with Biden's predecessor in terms of the US pulling out of the agreement. There have been claims that Iran has also been involved in misinformation campaigns within the US in favor of Biden.
Yeah, and they're pretty substantial claims, including from intelligence agencies. So.
Yes, exactly. And, I do think Iranians are concerned about what a second Trump term of maximum pressure would do to their economy.
What about China?
In terms of how Biden would proceed. For China,
Biden is going to be softer. I mean, Trump always accuses him of being softer on China. Do you think that's fair?
I don't think that's fair. I do think that Biden will probably operate on a very tough on China approach, similar to Trump. I think he will attempt more engagement and more cooperation on China with certain issues. For example, potentially working with them to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, or sharing resources for something like a global pandemic. But he has made clear that his main priority is worker infrastructure at home. So it's not likely that he would take a softer approach. I think from what we saw in the debates, foreign policy wasn't a topic of the debate, but China continued to come up as a punching bag that each opponent would use. So it's become very politicized, and there has been a clear shift in the way the American public views China. I do think they see it more as a threat in terms of economically and technologically. So I think Biden recognizes that, and while understanding the need for engagement and cooperation on certain issues, will maintain a tough stance on things like trade and intellectual property theft.
And now, coming back to Europe for a moment, I mean, do you think there's been a lot of nervousness over Trump? I mean, including on NATO. Would Trump withdraw from NATO, and was it just a good bargaining position that he took with trying to get NATO countries to come up to the 2% of GDP contributions, or was he serious? And then I've talked to other people that said actually he's been more pro-NATO now than maybe earlier on in his term. But in general, there is a sense in Europe, would you say, with the big countries certainly and the cornerstones of NATO, that Trump has just not been a reliable partner, and that they've had to take their own leadership. Like Merkel has said, we've got to lead from Europe. We can't just rely on America to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think this idea that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own defense is becoming more popular over here. I think Trump's, claims about defunding NATO are somewhat empty threats. I don't think he would actually, effectively abolish the alliance, but he has, announced that he's going to be removing, I think, 38,000 troops from Germany. I wouldn't need to double check that figure, but something around those lines. 6,000.
Essentially because he doesn't like Merkel. And I'll tell you, because I've talked to a lot of people in NATO and the former American commander of US forces in Europe, and it makes no sense because they've just restructured and upgraded a lot of their bases in Germany. And they say, essentially, it is because of the tension he has had with Angela Merkel, and that they're going to move some of those troops to Poland. So it's not. I don't want to create the impression that they're bringing them all back, but a lot of it just comes down to Trump's personality and the way he engaged with Merkel.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think Trump puts a lot of value into his personal relationship with leaders, and that really does impact his relationship and his policy, rightly or wrongly. As we discussed earlier, he has a not, I wouldn't say close relationship with Putin, but might see a like-minded figure
He
in
has a
Putin.
mysterious relationship with Putin at the very least.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And that, definitely influences some of his decisions in that respect. Likely that his, not so good relationship with Merkel encouraged him to relocate many of the troops that were stationed there.
He's been doing a series of tweets out of the hospital, the la 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 vote. One of them was peace through strength, bring our soldiers home, vote. I have no idea what he's talking about there. I assume it's Afghanistan, where, the US has been there since 9/11. And there are peace negotiations, so-called peace negotiations that are going on with the Taliban. But in general, there aren't very many troops left there anyway. There's about 5,000. I think they're down to 3,500 by the election time. And he wants to bring the rest home. A lot of people worry that Afghanistan's just going to turn around, put the Taliban back into power. And those 20 years of fighting, 19 years of fighting, brought us what? I don't know. I mean, the U.S. deconstructed bases that were being used by Al Qaeda, but where does that take us in terms of security in Afghanistan if he's just trying to do these slogans for the election, bring troops home? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been claims that Trump has spoken very negatively about military families. He's called them suckers and things like that. So I'm assuming that's his attempt at regaining that vote, in terms of making it clear that he does care about the troops and the families of the troops. Whether or not that's in the US's best strategic interest, I don't think is. But Trump has operated in the past based on impulse and not on what his advisors are telling him. So, for example, pulling out troops from Syria in such a hasty manner was really not encouraged, and he did so anyways,
From
giving
Syria.
Russia a huge yes in Syria, giving Russia a huge strategic victory and really undermining the US's influence in the region. So, like, good or bad, I don't think that it's unlikely that Trump would do that in Afghanistan as well.
I mean, it's very interesting what's happening because you take a look at some of the international vacuums that have been left under the Trump administration. Libya, where you now have Turkey and Syria backing different warlords and potentially being adversaries, and Syria. And then now also with Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus. And there are a lot of vacuums that are left by a lack of American leadership. And I don't know if that will return with Biden. Let's leave it there. Do you think that Biden will refill some of those gaps and put America's presence back? Or do you think that we're giving him too much credit without really understanding, his stated foreign policy in those areas? Because he hasn't said a lot. And frankly, the last debate didn't really deal with any of it.
So it didn't. Biden policy wasn't one of the debate topics, but it is quite interesting to look at where different countries did come up. It was around very politicized partisan issues within the states in terms of what was discussed at the debate. I do think Biden will make an attempt to repair relationships with allies, especially European allies, and to reassert America's role as a global leader by re-signing up to the Paris Accords, as we discussed earlier, by recommitting funding to the World Health Organization. So doing different things along those lines to strengthen international institutions. I do think that Europe will need to do more to show Biden and the states that they are willing to carry their own weight. So meeting that minimum spend for NATO, taking on more of their defense capabilities. I think the US is getting increasingly more concerned about the rise of China, and that will continue to be one of the major things that the next president, whoever it is, will focus on. And so, Europe needs to decide if they're willing to work with us on those issues, or if they would prefer to, just take a backseat and do their own thing.
Anar Bada, thank you so much. Anar is the coordinator of the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House. Thank you, Anar.
Thank you so much for having me.